Well, good afternoon, everybody. Glad to see you. Thanks for joining me. Wanted to put this stream up, sorry about the short notice, and discuss the new, coming up imminently, if all the chatter is to be believed, Sony ZV-E1, kind of like an alphabet soup. Yeah, this is supposed to be Sony's new vlogging camera, compact. We're going to go over some of the specs on this camera. We're going to go over why I think it maybe is a bit problematic, and it has to do with commonality of parts within Sony's lineup and also the alleged rumored spec. So in order to understand why I think this camera is a bit problematic, let me take you through a journey real quick of the sensor that it allegedly has, because the rumors out there are that it is going to have the same 12 megapixel, I think it's 12 megapixel sensor as the A7S Mark III family of cameras. That's a sensor that we waited a whole long time for, ever since the A7S II, waited 5 years to get the A7S III. It came out to a huge fanfare. I was one of the people who bought it kind of right away, before the FX3 was then released. A lot of people like the implementation of the FX3 because of the features that it gives. However, I still enjoy the A7S III as the better of those two cameras because of its EVF. And there's a lot of merit to an EVF when you're out there in bright sunlight shooting. You need to frame up your shot. Also, it gives you another point of contact for stability in your footage. But I digress. A7S III came out. Everybody mostly likes its sensor. It does have its issues as far as the second native ISO being way up at 12,800, which is typically not very useful to anybody, except when you're shooting in very low light. A lot of the other dual gain sensors that are out on the market right now, like for instance in the Canon R5C, which I have one of as well, is at a much more usable 3200 ISO. And I think that's where the majority of us kind of are going to hang out, and not that 12,800, which is big. So, hang on a second. I got my comments here going weird. Okay, so A7S III, FX3, same sensor, $3,500 approximately price point for each body. However, they have a different set of features, like we just said. EVF, XLRs on the handle, tally lights, so on and so forth. It essentially is the same camera. Right around that same time, as if the two wasn't enough, Sony also released the FX6. Now, this, in a lot of people's opinion, and in mine as well, is the current best implementation of this Sony 12 megapixel sensor. And yes, the image that is natively being captured from that sensor is the same as in the A7S III and the FX3, but the FX6 has a more robust codec that it records to, and so that gives it just that tiny little bit of edge. Another advantage of the FX6 is that it has defeatable noise reduction in camera, whereas the A7S III and the FX3 do not. What that ends up meaning is the A7S III, even at its native base 640 low ISO, is still being accosted by some level of non-defeatable in-camera noise reduction. And it is, in fact, smearier than the FX6 is, which is one of the reasons why when I'm talking about the A7S III, I tell people if you don't need the dynamic range that S-Log3 gives you, if your shot is something like this shot is a good example where this is a very controlled shot. I have lights and I know what my contrast ratios are and all that. If your shot is like this, I think the highest and best use of the A7S III is one of the baked-in profiles or in the picture profile off, if for no other reason, because that allows you to put your lower ISO, put your base ISO lower at like 100, 200, and the camera is not going to interject as much smeary noise reduction and make your image softer because of it. But, okay, so I think the FX6 is the best implementation of that same sensor, and it is the same sensor in those three bodies. Then we got the FX30, right, and A7 IV, we got all these cameras afterwards. Now the ZVE1 is coming out, and they're saying, the ubiquitous they, are saying that it's going to be the same sensor as the A7S III, the FX3, and the FX6. Oh, I almost forgot, there are PTZ cameras too that Sony released that are that same sensor. And that, by the way, just as an aside, those PTZ cameras being released at the time that they did, and Sony deciding to fill those orders when they had an FX6 backlog 3 miles long. I mean, I personally know somebody who waited 18 months to get an FX6. That is crazy. And the reason that's crazy is because the FX6 customer are professionals, a lot of them. These are people who are going out and making money with these cameras, and they're people who have contracts that need to be fulfilled, that they're waiting this much time for those cameras. I mean, heck, Red, which is a small US-based company in California, was able to push out Komodos faster than Sony, this global manufacturing giant, was FX6s. But, okay, so the PTZ cameras, going back to the ZVE1. Let's assume for a second that the rumors are true and that the ZVE1 is going to have that same sensor as FX3, FX6. What then would make me, Joe Blogger, pick up a ZVE1, especially if it's going to be at around a $3,500 price point, or I'm sorry, around a $3,000 price point? That is one of the rumors. I think maybe from Sony Alpha Rumors, about a $3,000 price point. First off, what are they going to strip out of it that the A7S III and the FX3 does not have? Well, certainly it's not going to have an EVF. And we know that because the FX3 is even more expensive. It doesn't have the EVF and so on and so forth. So it's not going to have an EVF. Okay, that's fine. Why wouldn't I still buy for a little bit more an FX3? See, the problem becomes not so much that I wouldn't spend a little bit more for the FX3 and the A7S III if they're going to be more fully featured, but the problem really is the A7 IV. The A7 IV at $2,500, which as a vlogging tool, I have one. I have one right here. So if you take this K3M module off the top of it, okay, as a vlogging tool, this is a compact camera. It has, you know, one of these tilty flippy screens that go out. You know, you take the cage off it and stuff like that. I use it differently than a vlogging camera, right? But that's a small camera. And you take that stuff off it, you take the K3M off it, you spend $500 less than what allegedly the ZVE1 is going to be. And it's also a very capable stills camera because it's a 33 megapixel sensor. The only thing, so there's two things that the A7 IV, there's only two things, I think, that the A7 IV has as a video camera that is worse than the FX series cameras with that 12 megapixel sensor in it. The first is Rollin Shutter performance. The A7 IV sensor is not a particularly fast read speed. And what that does is it gives you the jello effects when you're panning it around very quickly. Now, I have never found that to be problematic because that's not how I'm using that camera. I'm sure that some people do find it to be problematic, but it really is going to be most problematic if you are filming fast action or if you're doing a lot of handheld. I think a lot of people these days are lazy, myself included, in that good quality gimbals have become very affordable. And you're just not going to have rolling shutter issues when you're on a gimbal. I've used a lot of the Blackmagic Pocket 6K, which has awful rolling shutter on a gimbal, as did its predecessor, the A7 III. You know, and it hasn't really been problematic. But that is something where the A7S III, the FX3, FX6, those cameras are better for that. RPK, how you doing, bud? ZVE1 is going to be a camera for vloggers. That's what they're saying. You know, that's what they're saying. So the ZVE1 is apparently allegedly the world's most badassy vlogging camera for whatever. I don't know what else it would be, bud. Like, I don't know why, you know, like I was saying before, I don't know why Sony's lineup is becoming so dense, you know, and Canon's doing this too with their stills cameras. Do we need an R3 and R5 and R6 and R7 and R8 and R10? So, you know, do we need all these things? And half of them are below like the $1,500 price point. It's like, why do we need 5 cameras below the $1,500 price? But like, why do we need to populate a different camera body at every $200 increment in perpetuity? It doesn't make sense. And by the way, Canon, where the heck are the RFL wide lenses? Where's the L35? Where's the L24? That's what we want. Our L primes, wide ones. We don't need like an R9.5, whatever, you know. So yeah, that's what they're saying. RPK is that it's going to be a vlogging camera. So I was going over so the A7 IV, you've got the rolling shutter on the A7 IV. That's problematic. The only other thing that is problematic on the A7 IV versus the A7S III family cameras is and it has to do with the same problem actually. It's the lack of the sensor read speed that will give you those rolling shutter artifacts. Also means that it cannot do high resolution, high frame rates just because the sensor doesn't read fast enough. So it can't do a full frame 4K 60. I know that was a big thing when the A7 IV came out. People say, oh, it doesn't do 4K, it has this crop. It's, well, I mean, the sensor's not fast enough. But for a vlogging camera, the A7 IV packs a world more value than what we are now hearing about the ZVE1. Maybe I've got this wrong. I mean, and those of you watching, maybe you can chime in. Like, RPK, what have you heard about the ZVE1? I heard it was going to be a vlogging camera. I have a hard time seeing where it fits into Sony's lineup because this is the A7S III, FX3, FX6, whatever that PTZ camera. So this is like the 5th or 6th, I think, because there are a couple of those PTZ cameras available. This is the 5th or 6th Sony camera with allegedly this same sensor. And not only that, but this particular sensor on the A7S III, I have an A7S III, and don't get me wrong when I say this, because the A7S III, more than any other video camera, has made me more money than any camera I've ever had, as far as video cameras go. So I'm not throwing shade at the A7S III, But if I were, I would point out, first off, the in-camera noise reduction thing, which I was talking about with the S-Log profile versus going to one of the baked-in profiles. That's problematic on the A7S III. And the second is it really needs that noise reduction because even with it, it is a noisy camera. And I know that that's not going to be something that is going to be the prevailing popular YouTuber wisdom. I think a lot of the time because Sony has a lot of YouTube influencers on its dole, but that's a different conversation for a different day. But the A7S III family of cameras are noisy down low. And it's not so much that the noise itself is problematic, it's that, well, it's not that the amount of noise is problematic, I should say. It's because the type of noise is big, ugly, chroma, blotchy color noise. And that's just true. That's a fact. Anybody who's not on Sony's dole will tell you that about it. Haven't heard much about it. Not that into Sony rumors that much. I try not to be, but I find myself still straddling two systems. So I'm shooting this right now on Canon. I have a few other Canon bodies, a few Sony bodies. I recently sold my red Komodo, which I may make a video about. I sold my Blackmagic Pocket 6K because I didn't find myself using it that much. And it's really the same reason that I sold my red Komodo. And that is because going forward, I, as a one-man band most of the time going out there and shooting commercial work, want to have a reliable autofocus on board. It makes such a difference, even in shots just like this talking head studio type of setup where I'm controlling the lighting and, and so forth. It makes so much sense to have an autofocus that you can trust. So this is the C200, has a face-only autofocus is what I'm using right now. And I know I can trust it. I know that if I use a C200 as an A cam or a B cam, I can put it on a slider in motion and point it at my subject, that the autofocus, especially when it's on face only like this one is right now, that I'm going to be able to trust it, that it's going to keep my face in focus. And if the face comes out of focus, it's not going to do anything weird. Okay, the red Komodo, even though it has its face tracking autofocus that is still in beta, they say, but they call like whole operating systems beta with those cameras. So I don't know what exactly that means with red. Even though it's in beta, it's app based, and so it's not on the camera. They say it's coming to the camera, and it might be now. I sold mine a couple months ago, so I don't know if that has been implemented yet. But the problem is when it has your face and then it loses your face for any number of reasons. Okay, and my face is a good example of one that is hard for face focuses to hit because it's a big face, it's covered in hair. I like to wear hats and I like to wear glasses. And so, the AF systems need to be pretty robust to hit my face. And in fact, when I'm setting up a shot like this, just to make sure it does, I'll do things like this, and I'll take off my hat and I'll take off my glasses and have it hit my mug and then put my glasses and my hat back on. But anyway, so red's autofocus, when it loses your face, it wigs and it racks hard. Like it'll rack to the back and the front. So the Canon C series cameras, the C200s, like what I'm using, the R5C does this, the C70 does this, has a face-only autofocus, and that is super, super handy for people going out there and shooting corporate gigs, because a lot of what you shoot with corporate video gigs are shots just like this, that I'm doing right now. You've got somebody talking, you've got a couple angles on them, and it is super, super handy to have a camera that has a reliable face-only autofocus for that type of work. So those Canons do it. The Sony FX6 and FX9 do it. I don't think I have an A7S III. I don't think the A7S III or any other Sony camera does a face-only autofocus. They have face tracking, they have eye tracking, they have all this other stuff. They do not have a mode where if it does not find the face, it doesn't jump to something. So if the ZVE1 were to implement that, then that would be great. And that honestly would, would make me consider buying one for that type of work over an A7S3 FX3. But really, I think the A7 IV is the real sweet spot. And what's funny is when I bought the A7 IV, and I already had been using the A1 for my daily driver for my work. I bought the A7 IV really just on a whim because the 50 megapixel RAWs out of the A1 are very heavy. The 50 megapixel uncompressed RAWs are about 100 megabytes a piece. And so I, within my real estate and interiors work, will outsource a lot of my editing. And those files become very heavy. When you're doing flash ambient composites and you have editors that are remote and you're shooting these files back and forth, between people. So I bought the A7 IV to see if it was going to be a good approximation of the Alpha 1. The short answer is it's not, and I was a bit disappointed right away, right after I bought the A7 IV. But then something funny happened is I've been living with it for, I don't know, a year. Has it been out a year? Probably about a year. I've been living with the thing, and I really enjoy it now. I really enjoy the sharpness and the color rendering of the 33 megapixel sensor on the A7 IV. So the A1 is definitely sharper because it's 50 megapixel, but it's also flatter. So like the raw stills files coming out of the A1 are less contrasty and less punchy. So let me qualify that. The Adobe Lightroom interpretation of that data at the standard profiles and in the Adobe profiles too are less contrasty and less punchy. So the A7 IV looks better out of camera than the Alpha 1 does. Where the Alpha 1 shines is the files are much more robust. There's just a lot more data there for you to push and pull. And so even though the sensor is denser at 50 megapixels versus 33 megapixel, and that certainly has advantages as far as all-out resolution and sharpness and how much you can crop and so on and so forth, there's just the files in the A1 are just more robust, if that makes sense. It's hard, especially in the highlights. It's hard to qualify, but the Alpha 1 is certainly Sony's best sensor to date. Just like the so RPK, are you shooting Canon then? What do you have? I think you've participated in the streams before, and you were saying that you're shooting I think the C70, if I'm not mistaken. So, and those are some other rumors that that are kind of floating around. Is the new C200. I took advantage of the fire sale on the old C200s because for purposes like this, it's perfect. And it's difficult really to translate how good the C200 is over streaming because it's throttled by my janky internet connection and whatever streaming software I'm using, and all that. But the videos that I've tracked with the C200, it's gorgeous. I mean, the 12-bit raw coming out of the C200, and that is the highest and best, kind of the only use of the C200 is if you're going to be using that 12-bit raw, because the only other option is an 8-bit codec, and it just doesn't look as good. But the 12-bit raw coming out of the C200 is phenomenal looking, and that it has that face-only autofocus makes it, in my opinion, that much better. So new C200 rumor. They're going to allegedly have the same DGO sensor as the C70. I think everybody, myself included, is waiting for a full frame DGO sensor out of Canon. And for those of you who don't know, DGO is a sensor that in real time captures the exposure the image at two different exposures. And so it'll do, I think, one at the base. So it's dual gain sensors, one at the base and then one at the higher one. And what it does is it composites those in an HDR type of way in camera as it's doing it, as it's capturing it, or it writes it to the file like that. However it works, it ends up giving that camera more dynamic range than it would otherwise. And it works really, really well, especially for shadow recovery. So with cinema cameras, a lot of the time, you know, the wisdom with cinema cameras is to overexpose them by a stop or so. And really the theory behind that is cinema cameras are better at recovering highlights. They have a really soft knee as they approach that white point, and that's true with most of them. And it's true even with a lot of the mirrorless cameras that are not cinema, like the A7S III is like that. You know, you can overexpose the A7S III and still get a lot of nice highlight detail in it. But if you underexpose the A7S III with that ugly chroma noise we were talking about, that's not good. The C70 kind of works different. It works opposite like that. You want to protect your highlights because the latitude isn't in the highlights. The latitude is in the shadows, and you can pull up the shadows on the C70. So you really, I mean, from what I know of it, you're really best off just exposing dead on at zero, you know, and not going over or under. Whereas most cameras, like I said, especially in the log curves, you want to expose them over a little bit, and that's true with the C200 as well. The C200 works best, I've found so far. Not quite a stopover, but about half to 3/4 of a stopover is where I'm liking the C200 the best. So anyway, just wanted to pop on and talk about the ZVE1. I don't know who it's for. Well, let's talk about that. You know, who is this for? Who would buy the ZVE1 at $3,000 with an A7S III sensor versus the A7S III or the FX3, or the A7 IV at $500 less? That's the real sticky point, you know, that the A7 IV is $500 less, and that the FX30 with its Super 35 sensor is what, $700 or $800 less? No, more than that, huh? What is that? Yeah, it's like $1,700. It's like $1,300 less if the ZVE1 is the $3,000 price point that everybody says it's going to be. It's going to have to be cheaper. It's going to have to be cheaper, or it's going to have to do some kind of sorcery that we've never seen before, because the things that cost in Sony land, and so that is dual CFX-A implementation costs money. Good screens cost money. Magnesium bodies that are sealed all over the place cost money. So if you're going to make this vlogging camera and it's going to be weather sealed with a decent screen that you can see yourself with, and it's going to be the full frame sensor that's the same 12 megapixel sensor as the A7S III FX3, I can see how it would have to be $3,000, but I don't see who the customer is. I mean, maybe you guys can let me know in the comments below, because I'm going to get going here. But just wanted to pop in and say that I don't understand what the ZV-E1, what the heck is this thing called? ZV-E1, what the alphabet soup camera. I don't understand who it's for. So thanks for hanging out with me, RPK. Hey, it's good to see you. The several others that I see are watching but haven't commented, it's good to see you guys too. Go ahead, and I've got a lot of videos coming up, you know, so if you like this type of content around cameras, I have a whole list of videos that I'm going to be making here in the next few weeks. So it's my slow season for my real estate gig. So I decided I'm going to sit down and make a bunch of YouTube videos. So if you like that, subscribe and all that YouTuber stuff, and I'll see you again soon. Peace.